So, for those of you joining us, welcome to tonight's program on Old South High, a look at several landmarks in the neighborhood and a number of personalities who influenced the course of Harrisonburg's history. I am delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. E.K. Knappenberger is a local historian with a background in military intelligence, now working on religious and educational history. He has a graduate degree from Eastern Mennonite Seminary and degrees from Eastern Mennonite University and Whatcom Community College. He has recently published several works on various local topics, including the founding of JMU and EMU, Joseph Funk and Singer's Glen. C.H. Brunk's autobiography, and Major Jedidiah Hotchkiss's 1840s unpublished early art. I'm curious about that. In getting to know Evan over the past year or so, I have noticed that his signature seems to be finding the little known details in our history and weaving them together. I'm curious to see what he reveals tonight. So please help me welcome Evan. This side.
All mic'd up.
All mic'd up. Yes.
All right.
Can't get away now.
I see some familiar faces. I understand there's quite a good number of people online watching. Hello to everybody. I want to just say real quick, I started this project for Roy Early over here, who owns this Strayer Liggett Early house, you can see on the right. I did that starting in about March, and I quickly realized that the project needed to be bigger. And so I kind of expanded down the road over this. And I think I've come up with some new things. There's a lot of history details that are cloudy and murky that people haven't agreed on in the past. So I just want to preface this by saying this is my interpretation. I'm not claiming this is the absolute one. I wanted to start with this picture. This is the prized item in the collection here at Rocktown History. It's in the gallery if you want to see it. I don't know if they'll open up afterwards, but you can come back in the weekend and pay the entrance fee and look at it.
Members are free.
Rocktown is a great organization. I've been a member for several years. It's worth it, I think. This is a painting done by a woman named Emma Lyon Bryan. It was a copy of an earlier painting by a famous German artist named Ed Beyer, who she studied under. And it represents Harrisonburg between 1850 something, probably 1855 was my guess, and 1867. The original has been lost. Unfortunately, don't know what the original looked like. I think what happened is Emma Bryan went back through and added things that had changed between 55 and 67. It's a beautiful piece. You can see some of the editorial decisions here. The height has been kind of exaggerated, the elevation gains. I see Steve, a geologist, is kind of laughing. One of the first things I kind of noticed about this, editorially speaking, is the lack of industry. Right? It's a beautiful place to live. It looks completely agrarian. You can see, I wanted to point this out. This is the old jail right here. And this little area was, you can see that the houses themselves are a different color. It was the free Negro area of town. Of course, later on, Newtown gets started over here. Notice also there's some of these same dark drab colored buildings off on the side. We'll come back to that. The first maps of Harrisonburg, there is no Warm Springs Turnpike. In fact, this was the survey map done by Claudius Crozet, who the city of Crozet is named after, when they were surveying Route 33 West, what we know as Route 33 West. And The date given on it is 1828. I wanted to plug this book here too. It's on the cover of this book. This is David Aaron Price and Bill McAllister and some other folks that you might know. It's a great book, and I'm borrowing a little bit out of that for this. As you can see here, you have this Methodist church right across from the jail, which we just saw. And right over here is now the neighborhood of Old South High and the area of that picture that we're kind of looking down this way. And of course, on the final version of the map, it's been simplified. Some of that terrain and stuff gets left off. Just trying for a minute to imagine Harrisonburg in 1828. There were, I read there were Indians that came through every year on their way to Washington, D.C., Native Americans. The whole tribe would kind of walk down the valley turnpike going to DC. This was, by the way, the only real road in that time. There was reportedly a cattle stampede in Fort Square about the time this map was made. If you can imagine that. So really what I want to focus on tonight is these three properties and the history that I found on them. Let's look at this picture for a minute. This is in the collection here too. The position that we're looking at here is now up Bruce Street. This is Bruce Street here. You can notice the sidewalk is these boardwalks before the modern kind of paving thing that we have now. Now there is a big train depot right here. In the past, the train depot was this little ticket stub booth. This house here was owned by a guy named Messerly, is no longer standing. There is a house now here that I'm referring to as the Tutwiler house, the Strayer Liggett Early house, and the Bradley. This is the Bradley house, and then this is the Bradley Foundry, just for reference here. Of course, the railroad now is a little bigger here too. The position where this is looking at is now the ice house. So there were a couple of things, different histories that kind of conflict. So doing this project, I kind of had to navigate some of those. The man in the middle here is Philo Bradley, and he's kind of the central character. And he was born in New York. I'll be talking about him. He came down and he basically built that whole neighborhood. And for better or worse, it's Philo Bradley's, and it always has been. The article on the left, I'm sorry, the old newsprint is just impossible to read sometimes. This is the best I could do with the scans that are available. I just wanted to read a little bit of it. This is from 1866, right at the end of the Civil War. This foundry, whilst it may not be so large, requires so much puffing as other similar establishments now springing into existence all around us. Claims to be the pioneer of iron foundries in the upper part of the Valley of Virginia. Let's see here. The foundry now labors under the disadvantage of having to procure its metal and coal in Richmond and to transport them a part of the way in wagons drawn by horses. These difficulties will be obviated after a while when coal and iron will be brought to Harrisonburg by railroad, and when our people will enjoy the advantages of greatly cheapened castings. When that day arrives, and it is coming rapidly, our people will wonder how they ever managed to get along for so many years without a railroad. So it was about a year after this that the railroad got put in, and business all over just kind of bloomed from that. The article on the right here is a little easier to read. Was one of the first main histories of the foundry business. One of the things that it claims in here is that the original foundry was started in an old distillery or brewery. And I want to come back to these, what I'm calling free Negroes, I guess, people of color, formerly enslaved persons. As you can see, this is the Valley Pike. Again, all of the big stately homes were situated on this pike. And during slavery times, the slaves would live out back. And this is kind of part of our story that we've neglected for a long time, which is why I wanted to share this. As you can see, the people of color get pushed to the margins. And that's been true here since the very beginning. And the lack of industry that I mentioned, the foundry would have been right off of the corner of the picture here. So again, there's that editorial decision where they didn't want to include that in their ideal picture of Harrisonburg, Emma and Var. So they just kind of ended the picture right there and just kind of hinted at these margins just a little bit. So in thinking about this, I came to that article from 1899, which I just showed you, and I realized breweries and foundries have something in common. They both need water. They both need to kind of be out of the way. You don't want them in the middle of town necessarily, especially if they're run by people that you don't want in your town. So the conjecture that I've come to is that most likely the distillery brewery that was there was started by enslaved people. And by 1840s, it's been commercialized. In other words, white people have taken it over. And again, for better or worse, this is kind of par for the course. You know, something, our slaves have something valuable, so let's monetize that, right? So the man here is David Steele Young. He was an attorney in Stanton. He was really a big deal. He met Abraham Lincoln in Illinois on a visit, and it convinced him to change his political party. And he became something of a unionist, which is interesting. And I hit a dead end because the Bradley deeds only go back so far. And the reason for that is during 1864, when the Union troops came through, all the courthouse records were loaded into a wagon by a guy named A.M. Newman. And they got burned on their way to Richmond for safekeeping. So we only have partial records. We don't have a full picture. It's really hard to reconstruct those things. So I've drawn my skills as a Army intelligence analyst to kind of look backwards at this. So I discovered this using this brand new thing in the digital humanities, OCR text recognition. Millions of pages of newspaper have been scanned by robots, basically. And you can sometimes search words out, like using Google on these things. And this is kind of a new development. A lot of these things have never been looked at before. For example, this ad that was in 1841 in the Rockingham Register. And I noticed this name, Young and Cox, and I pieced that together from this deed from a guy named Abe Williams, and his business partner and attorney was David Steele Young, when they sold that property to the Bradleys. And you can see here how hard it is to kind of read through all that stuff. I had to do all of that. I read through probably 400 of these things. So who are these people, right? Well, I went back and I found stuff on them all. So Abe Williams, the name that I just mentioned, he was a Lutheran guy. He at one point owned that brewery that I'm asserting was probably taken over from people of color. And when he sold out of it, he kind of retired out into the country. He's related to some people that you might know. Fanny Loman was a famous teacher. Some of these names come back later. in the story. But one of the things that I found interesting about Abe Williams is he was in a lawsuit against his own church. And so, I mean, he's a good Christian, right? And he's earnest and unassuming, even though he made his fortune off of alcohol. And he brought lawsuits on behalf of his church. I don't think the brethren and the Mennonites in the area would have agreed that he was a great Christian, just based on that. Another character in this story who's very important is Jonas Lowenbach. And Lowenbach's fortunes rose and fell a couple of times. And I thought this was funny. Here's a couple of articles about Jonas Lowenbach. Blacks run the spasmodic stream. That's I hadn't thought of blacks run the spasmodic. This is actually the first earliest bit of environmentalism that I can find that I've seen in Rockingham County history. D.M. Switzer was the mayor of Harrisonburg in the 1870s, and he's suing Lowenbach, who owns the tannery that we'll see, for dumping waste into Black's Run. And as you might imagine, businesses like breweries that are just downstream from from the tannery dumping all of this toxic waste would not benefit from that. Another thing that was interesting here, they're arguing here that for 70 years, and this is in 1877, that this tannery had been operating already, which is far earlier than anybody has kind of suspected that that was going. On the right is another article. Lowenbach was an industrialist. He was like the Ayn Rand character in the story, where he loved trains and mines and anything factory related. He also was a land developer. Land developing, by the way, has been and still is, I think, one of the main industries in this area. And that goes all the way back to the Crown patents in 1730s. So the big three guys that I want to talk about, the Bradley brothers. And the main Bradley brother, again, that we saw was Philo. And he was the younger of the three. And the oldest was a guy named Skyler. Skyler came down from New York. They were all from northern upstate New York, and they were part of this 150-year-old business family tradition of iron. And the father had them do this. It's really a fascinating study in kinship. The father was both the patriarch and the boss, and he kind of directed his children around in order to build this kind of empire. And he would apprentice them. So all three of these boys had to learn the art of iron casting. And this is a time when you had to hand carve your castings, right? So it was a craft, it was a real art. They would pour these big vats of iron into their hand carved castings. And before things became really mechanized, it wasn't one of these Yankee industrial families that kind of governed from afar. These boys were getting their hands dirty and getting burned on a regular basis. And anyway, they were also kind of doing their own venture capital thing. I found their names on this list of delinquent investors in 1843 in Lynchburg. I also found, we'll get into this a little more, in 1862, Skyler, who was already an old man, joined the Confederate militia, even though he didn't have to. And I also wanted to point out, not to get political, there are a lot of Yankees. This is an article on the militia leaders of these units of old men and young boys who weren't allowed to join the army proper. So they formed these volunteer militias. And a number of names on this list are actually people from the North, including Skyler Bradley, right? One of the cool things about this project is that a lot of records from the Bradley business survive. And this is in the JMU Special Collections Library. They have a pretty good collection of all this stuff. This is their business ledger for the 1860s. And it's really kind of cool. Almost anybody you can think of, many of you locals, your ancestors are in here. I just opened to a random page, and here's William H. Ruffner. Ruffner is considered the father of public schools in Virginia. And there he is, and what he's buying, and how many dollars and cents he owes. The foundry business almost exclusively did plows and stoves. In other words, household implements. It wasn't mechanized stuff that we would think of now. P. Bradley and Sons, by the way, is still an equipment company going here in Dayton. In fact, I think Gordon, the owner, is watching on Zoom. Again, I wanted to go back and tell this other part of the story. There's no evidence that Philo Bradley used slaves, that any of the Bradley brothers ever used slaves. In fact, they imported their labor from the North. They would get craftsmen from their family business who were looking for a change maybe, or tired of being in New York, and they would recruit them to come back to Virginia and work here. The other iron furnaces in the area, including the big one was in down south of Bridgewater, was the Forer Foundry. They relied very heavily on slaves. They had hundreds of slaves. That didn't, because the Bradley family didn't use slaves, doesn't mean they weren't involved in slave-related business. So one of the neighbors that they did business with a lot was S.M. Bowman, and S.M. Bowman was known as a slave trader. And you can see here, it's a sad history. He's selling what it seems to be his specialty. Almost every newspaper from those 15 or 20 years has an ad for slaves from the Bowmans. His specialties seem to be these women, these girls, really 14-year-old girls with an infant. So it's unfortunate. It's part of our history. I think we ought to acknowledge that and hold that. So along came the Civil War. You had the Bradley family established between Stanton and Harrisonburg and New York. Nelson, by the way, had been in Ohio when the war started recruiting workers. And as soon as the war started, he couldn't travel anymore. This broke ties. And the sensible thing to do if you were a Northerner in the South at this point is to pack up and leave and to get out. The Bradleys did not do that. They stayed. In fact, Benjamin Bradley was the heir of Skyler. He's the oldest of all the cousins in that generation. He volunteered. He had been in college. He was part of the Liberty Hall volunteer Company I of the 4th Virginia Infantry, the Stonewall Brigade. And he was killed at the Battle of Manassas. This is a picture of the Battle of Manassas. So here's a kid from Stanton whose cousins are in the Union Army, and they're killing each other. Here's a famous picture. This is a sketch from 1864. These are Union troops coming down the road. This is Main Street. This is Main Street, Harrisonburg, and this is Crook's Army of West Virginia. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I discovered recently I have an ancestor who was in Crook's Army of West Virginia. So, it's interesting. The Civil War was really, really hard on this area. I don't want to go into too much detail on that. This is a very cool picture, by the way, that's only recently been digitized, I think, by Library of Congress. Not entirely sure where it is. The caption read near Harrisonburg. I'm not sure if it might be up at Brock's Gap. That's kind of what it looks like to me. But there were burnings going on a lot. There was a lot of fighting. Things were really destructive. At the end of the war, the Bradley Foundry had to pack up, close the doors, and quit doing business. There wasn't sufficient business to be done. They couldn't get iron. They couldn't get coal to fire the iron. The thing just collapsed. How they survived, I don't know. Those records, by the way, are lost. That whole time period is just not in this book, right? So it just picks up again later. But immediately after the war, after this massive loss, Ben Bradley, the kid that was killed in the Battle of Manassas, I think he was supposed to be the one to kind of be the next patriarch of the family. It was a huge blow. This is a map from the 1880s. You can see, we're going to look at a few maps. I love maps. You can see kind of the way things have developed. Again, that original map of Harrisonburg was about 4 blocks, like 2 blocks deep. And now you have Old South High. At that point, it was called the Warm Springs Turnpike. And that was kind of just in the foreground of that picture of Emma and Brian. Again, here's the Bradley Foundry. He owns all of this land. Back here was the county fair. And there was a horse showing grounds there. It's now the JMU baseball complex. Sorry, this is really kind of blurry, but you get a sense of how big the town was. Again, here's the Bradley complex. In 1877, Bradley has already started subdividing his lots. So we'll come back to that. Here is the tannery that J.A. Lowenbach built. Immediately after he built it, he went bankrupt. So, like I said, his J.A. Lowenbach's fortunes rose and fell. He was actually part of another family business. This kind of gives you a sense of how business was done in the 19th century. He was part of a family business in Baltimore of Austrian immigrants. And he decided he was going to branch out and be just as good as anybody else in the family. And I don't think it really worked out for him. He ended up developing that whole neighborhood back on Academy Street. And it ended up in kind of a bad condition. I wouldn't say it was a slum necessarily, but Lowenbach did not enjoy a high degree of success in a lot of things. More maps. This is great. It's hard to read, Fairgrounds. Up here at the very top. So again, this is the Bradley Foundry lot, which is now owned by Matchbox, I understand. And I went by there today. They're doing some really good work on that place. It's looking a lot better than it had been. Bradley also owned on the other side of Old South High along Black's Run. The original foundry would have been right in here somewhere, the distillery. And I have a picture of that later. Bradley starts, after the war, he starts developing. And the thing that I found really interesting about that, he's selling almost exclusively to his employees, right? So he's trying to be a fair and equitable employer. And he's selling these lots at not a very high price. I think what he's doing is developing this neighborhood as like his industrial neighborhood. And the farther away from the foundry that you get, the lower value of the properties and the houses. And that's true even today, as you move down that street. Okay, so here's Philo again, just so you remember who he is. Philo was a master mason, and the only way I could find this picture was in the history of masonry. There's not, I think this is the only picture of him that is still around. So, one of the enduring mysteries of Harrisonburg history is, how did Joshua Wilton come to be in Harrisonburg? Joshua Wilton was born in Canada. Yes, there are Canadians in Harrisonburg. I understand that some of the Joshua Wilton House folks are also zooming in, so this is great. This is a portrait by Mike Reisenberg. It's beautiful. I love it. It's also based on a Mason photo, which is probably the only photo of Joshua Wilton. How did Joshua Wilton come to be in Harrisonburg? Well, I think I solved that one. And it starts with this notice. At some point in 1867, right after the railroad is built, Philo Bradley has just expanded at a great expense his business. He's built on new buildings. The whole new side of the foundry that we would know today as the Foundry was built around that time. He's survived the Civil War and all the destruction. There was a terrible depression still going. There was famine sometimes. There was a lot of race violence going on. There was a lot of theft and crime. It was not a good time to be in Harrisonburg. Philo at one point decides, I'm done. I'm out. So he puts this ad in the paper. He says, for the next 30 days only, I'm offering to sell my business for next to nothing. But it has to go to a young man who's capable of running it, who is a moral and upstanding person. And if in 30 days nobody comes forward, then I'm taking the offer back. Very interesting. I don't think he got any good responses. So what does he do then? He goes off and he starts recruiting. Right. And this is the kid that he recruited, is Joshua Wilton. So this is how Joshua Wilton came to be in Harrisonburg. They were both ended up being very important figures. They were both like Chamber of Commerce presidents. They were both master masons when that was very important to business. They were both back-to-back bank presidents of the main bank in town. The list goes on. They were two of the most important people in the area. And I think the reason that Joshua Wilton ended up that way is because Philo trained him. And for 10 or 11 years, Joshua Wilton actually worked side by side with Philo. And I'm sure he had to go through the whole process of learning how to carve castings and keeping the books and everything. You can see in those ledger books where the handwriting kind of changes, the style changes, and Joshua Wilton's taking over, which is kind of cool. Anyway, by the time Philo's sons are old enough to take over the business, to get involved, he had, I think, 5 or 6 sons by 2 wives and a number of girls. By the time they were getting interested in joining the family business, Joshua Wilton felt like he had been trained, he had built up enough of his own capital. He decided he was going to buy out of the business. So one of the things, I guess I should stay here. One of the things that he does is, again, Philo was the consummate like ethical businessman. And every source on Philo has always said this, like he was the most responsible. He would give you every penny. He wouldn't cheat a fly. He wouldn't dream of being unethical. Philo decides he's going to give a chunk of his land, if he's going to equally distribute part of his business. When Joshua's buying out, he says, well, I should give you a chunk of the land that we own together, as they had been partners for a decade. And that piece of land, Wilton decided he was going to build a house on. And it's fun to think that maybe Roy's Strayer Liggett house would have actually been the Joshua Wilton house. I don't know why he decided against living on the top of the hill there. He decided he wanted to be on Main Street instead. Not sure why. Anyway, so he sold that lot of land, which we're now calling the Strayer Liggett land, to this woman named Juliet Strayer. And here we're presented with another mystery, which is cool. Juliet Strayer was from a very important family. She had connections all over. Her husband was also very important. This family was full of lawyers. And the bigger picture here is, with all of this kind of blossoming industry going on, you have a whole second set of people that kind of do business around that. And the big one here is the lawyers. So one of the reasons I love this project and think that it's worth paying attention to, it's just one stretch of a road here. It's a tiny neighborhood, but it's a microcosm of Harrisonburg. It's a microcosm of the valley. You can see the whole history of the place that we love in this one stretch of road and these couple of properties. So at this point in the 1870s, these businessmen they're doing really well. And they have this secondary group of people who are lawyers and bankers and just kind of all thriving off of the industry that's going on. I wanted to point this out. Here is Juliet Strayer, who built the house that I'm calling the Strayer Liggett early house. This is her obit, written by Emma Lyon Bryant, right, who was the painter of the picture that we saw. So, and she's saying she died as she lived well. She was a tender woman. She was the model of a pure woman, a devoted mother, a perfect wife, true friend. This was interesting. She was equitable to rich and poor, white or colored. I found her name in all sorts of stuff. She was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. All the respectable ladies in town were part of that. I think she was even a state delegate to the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had hundreds of thousands of members. She was quite a woman. So the mystery is, why was the property referred to as the Juliet Strayer property and not the C.C. Strayer property? For a woman to own property when she was married was kind of unusual. So the answer I've settled on is this guy, C.C., her husband, Crawford Kaufman Slayer. You can see all the Kaufmans in here. Was involved in a lot of lawsuits. And there's several times throughout the 1870s and 1880s where he's had his assets frozen by the court, or he's required to pay something back that he probably didn't have right then. Not to suggest that he was in any way unethical or anything. He just had a lot of these lawsuits. And I think what they did was they transferred that property to Juliet as a way of protecting it from any type of legal chicanery. Part of the reason for this, I don't know if we're aware of this, I certainly wasn't until very recently. The Confederacy passed a law in 1861, the intent of which was to prevent any money from leaving the Confederacy. So if you died intestate, or if your heirs were outside of the bounds of the Confederacy, which included like places where the Union Army was in control, you couldn't inherit, right? So the Bradley family, for example, had family on both sides of the border, and this innumerably complicates the inheritance laws. There were 2 Supreme Court cases about this in the 1880s. There was a huge part of the reason there was a big legal industry was because you had to settle all this stuff in court. You couldn't just arbitrate things. Oh, let me go back for a second. I missed something here. So J.D. Price. This is why Philo, I think, got really tired of being in business and wanted to quit for about a year. J.D. Price was a land agent and a lawyer here in town, and He started in 1867 publishing notice that he was going to be buying property for the Pittsburgh Steel Company. And this meant big competition. Pittsburgh Steel Company had made a huge profit during the war, whereas the Bradley Foundry had gone under for a while. This must have been terribly disheartening. I suspect that those two things are related, that the reason Philo decided to give up was because he thought the Pittsburgh Steel Company was going to come get him. So, gentrification, enter the lawyers. You have this blooming industry of middle-class people and lower upper class people in Harrisonburg that are bankers and merchants and lawyers. And the landscape reflects this. So here we have 1891. You can see they've just given a tiny corner of, these are fire insurance maps. One of the best records we have. These are all digitized on the Library of Congress website. You can go look at them, they're great. You can see all the buildings in town and what they were made of and where the stove was. So 1891, you just have a couple of buildings here. They've given it just a tiny corner of the map. By 1907, you can see the Strayer Liggett house is here. This is the Messerly house, which has been torn down. You can see that Philo has rebuilt his, this is his house. He's been adding on buildings here. And then by 1924, you have this whole neighborhood, right? And sorry, this extension of the map starts here again. So you can see, basically still today, this is the neighborhood 100 years later. You have the Foundry, and then you have progressively smaller and dingier houses as you go down Old South High. And again, that was for the workers. Philo built this neighborhood, developed it for his workers.
High school was not in there.
High school was back here, I think. So on this map, the high school would have been about right in here, I think. This is a cool picture on the Library of Congress. This is Harrisonburg in 1907. You can see the tannery that we looked at. This is the bank building. I think this is now Bella Gelato and the Emporium down here. We're kind of looking south and what's that? Almost due south, I suppose. You can see the new neighborhood over here that's now is just stretches to infinity. JMU is now on this hill. That's kind of the main hill there. This was the year that JMU was founded. This is what the town looked like when that started. And this was the middle of town. That was the outskirts. That was the far off suburb. So imagine that, right? Juliet Strayer sold her land. She decided she didn't like living there in the Strayer Liggett house, where she wanted to do better. I think probably she was trying to downsize. She had had a stroke. Her brother had been staying with them, and this is a cool story for the house. If you ever want to go get a tour from Roy, I'm sure he'd be happy to take you. As you go into the house, there's this beautiful big stairway. It's just amazing. And Roy's done a really good job of keeping that up. And they found Mary Kaufman Liggett's brother. Sorry, I was saying Juliet Strayer. It was Mary Kaufman Liggett's brother. Was staying with them for a visit and fell down the stairs. They found him dead at the bottom of the stairs. I haven't heard any ghost tales about this, but if there were any ghosts in that house, that's what I would imagine. Oh, and his name was Erasmus Kaufman. He was the court clerk for a lot of those old documents. I couldn't find too much about Winfield Liggett. He was also a lawyer. He was a nephew of Juliet Strayer. So when they decided to downsize, she sold it to a relative. He was also a law partner with her son. Again, family connections. characterized the business community. It was a very kind of closed business community. It's not nearly like today where you can get a degree and go into business. You really had to have connections and capital. These are cool too. These are in this book by Aaron Price. I think they're from the War Department in the 40s. This is the Foundry. There's more of these that are not in the book on the Library of Congress website. You can find those pretty easily. I mean, look at these guys. It's hard work. It's dirty. Right? And it was about this time in the 40s that the foundry business started expanding beyond just like household wares and farm equipment. Right? The War Department needs became very important. You can see they had some very fine machine stuff too. That building had to adjust a number of times. One of the coolest parts of this story that I am just fascinated with is Winfield Liggett Jr., who grew up in the Strayer Liggett house. And that's him with the red arrow on top of him. Winfield Liggett Jr.'s uncle was a famous admiral. His name was DeWitt Kaufman. And there's a ship named after him in the Second World War. He was this famous World War I admiral from Rockingham County. And Winfield Liggett, son of Junior, grew up in that house, probably learned how to play cards with his mother, who was a socialite. And his uncle, who was the admiral, got him into the U.S. Naval Academy when he was of age. And he became a naval officer, and he retired from that and became his second career, professional bridge player. This was so exciting. People loved, I had no idea. I would have imagined football and baseball and things. This was in Sports Illustrated, right? There's a cover of like a 1940s Sports Illustrated with bridge, contract bridge on it. Right? This was from a Washington, D.C. paper. I'm sorry about the quality of it. Front page news about the bridge game of the century. And there's one of our Harrisonburg boys. So the story is really interesting. There's a novel that was recently written about this game of the century that lasted for a month or two. And hundreds of thousands of dollars changed hands during this game. And these two are the Culbertsons, and they were the bad guys. Everybody was rooting against them. They were kind of these, he was like Hungarian, and she was kind of this, nobody kind of knew her past. They were mean to people. They had developed their own system that people thought was just a little bit shady, maybe. And the good guy was Sidney Lenz, and he's going to come in and set things right. And he picks Winfield Liggett Jr. as his partner. So, and I'm not entirely sure what happened. I read two different accounts of what happened after this game. The good guys won. And then in the book that's written about it, I think what happens is Mrs. Culbertson shoots and kills Mr. Culbertson. I'm not entirely sure that that's true, but I've read that. So, like I said, this was front page news for weeks. This game of the century. And he wrote books. Winfield Liggett Jr. wrote books. I'm trying to get my hands on them. The Art of Playing Bridge. So one of the things that the Liggett family did, let me go back. This is the perfect example here. Winfield Liggett Jr. is the perfect example of modernity and the changes that came to Harrisonburg. Here's a guy whose grandfather was a farmer and who was in the Confederate Army. His father kind of took a step up and became a lawyer and went to college. And here he is at the top level of society. He's famous, he's respectable, with big sums of money going through his hands. He's kind of the acme of society at that point. And this is just a guy who grew up in this house in Harrisonburg, this sleepy little agrarian community. So this is the Liggett lot that Joshua Wilton sold to Juliet Strayer, who sold it to the Liggets. And after the Liggett parents both were gone, the sons decided they were going to subdivide. And they broke it into these 5 lots. This is the main one that the Strayer Liggett house is on. This is what I'm referring to as the Tutwiler lot. And then these 3 are now part of 42, but they were houses on them for a while. So I wanted to talk about lot number 2. It got sold and resold about 3 times in about a year and a half. One of Philo Bradley's employees was a guy named Tommy Bassford, who wrote A History of Harrisonburg. Briefly owned it and then sold it and doubled his money in like 6 months. The guy who finally settled on it was this guy, Eugene Tutwiler. And these are original pictures we found in an old trunk in an attic. So this is probably the first time they've been seen in public, I imagine. Eugene Calvin Tutwiler Sr. and his wife. Eugene was a grocer. And he represents the growing merchant class in town, right? There were probably about 6 grocery stores in the downtown area to serve a population of 2,000, right? Oh, I like this. Application to sell soft drinks. When Prohibition took over, if you had been selling soft drinks, soda fountains, one of the stipulations of Prohibition was you now had to apply to get a license to sell soft drinks. So here's a list of people who applied the day that Prohibition took effect. And there's E.C. Tutwiler. Well, I also wanted to say, all of these guys got into politics. That was the thing to do. You just put your name out there and you run for office. It's kind of hard to imagine now. Anybody who was a church-going, like, social person would just get asked to run for office. So one of the things that I didn't include in this that I would have liked to if I had more time is all the politics stuff. And it got really messy and it's really interesting. So a side note here. In the back here, I have books. It's about, I cut it down from 300 pages to about 230. It's source material for all of this stuff. There's a lot more in there that I couldn't go over in here. So if you're interested, there's books in the back that you can have and read more of this stuff. Yes, for sale.
Yes.
Well,
You can have for.
yes, well, I printed and bound them myself. I bought a binder and did it myself. And it cost about $15 to make a copy. So I'm asking donations to Rocktown History. I'm not making any money off of it. And if you'd like one, I can make more if there's not enough. Just let me know. Please consider giving a donation to Rocktown and support this cause. And I would say probably minimum $15 would be nice. Oh, so let's get back to Lowenbach here. This is Lowenbach's son. Remember, Lowenbach was the tannery guy. He went bankrupt a few times. He tried to start a railroad that never happened. He's just kind of a down and outer. And here's his son who continues that tradition. Lowenbach briefly owned, Jonas Lowenbach, the elder, briefly owned some of the land that got incorporated into the P. Bradley stuff as a speculator. And at one time, I think very briefly, he owned the Liggett lot. And Albert was just a boy and would have grown up as close friend of the Liggets and the Tutwilers. And Albert would have looked up at that house. He lived just down the hill. He would have looked up at that house as like the place that he could never have. Became a traveling salesman, and for a little while was quite successful. Tried to open his own business in like 1920s. And then, of course, the Great Depression hits, and he just is a plunger. He goes broke. He's a tragic figure, and I'm saying it's not him that's a tragedy. It's the circumstances that he lived through. Anyway, he went broke. He went bankrupt, and the house was put up for auction on public auction. And we come to the longest part of the Strayer Liggett early house history. We're very lucky here. We have this woman on the right here, Cindy Suter, who spent a good chunk of her life in the Strayer Liggett early house when it was owned by Addie Burkholder. So Addie and W.P. Burkholder bought the house at public auction in the 30s at the height of the Great Depression. And then Addie lived there for like 50 years. And I think WP died within a decade or two. And Addie was like the queen of the hill. And all the stories I've heard about Addie are that she was quite the woman. She would, this little old lady in her 80s and 90s would be up on the roof with a bucket of hot tar, or down in the crawl space with like a crowbar or something. Just a really interesting lady. If you like, Cindy can tell you stories. Cindy, for a brief while when she was a baby, she lived in the house. And then again, when she was going to college, she came and she got a kind of a back hallway room that didn't really lead anywhere, where the phone was that people I guess would go to make a phone call privately. And she got her little cot in the room there while she was a student at JMU. So, sorry, is that all accurate?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yes. There's this one, yeah. So after Addie kind of passed, Roy Early bought the place. But before we go there, I wanted to do this part of the modern story. Remember E.C. Tutwiler, right? His sons took over the family business when he was ill. And he had these two sons, Roland, who was a natural businessman. He was super popular and well-connected. He was just took to it like a fish in water. And Gene was kind of the very shy, quiet one. And Gene wanted to go to college. That was his dream. And he was in his second year at Shenandoah University in Shenandoah College in Dayton here when his father got sick and he was called away from college to take care of the business with his brother. And he never got to go back. I think he always wanted to. But then a few years later, R.E. Tutwiler is tragically killed in an accident. Life was still a little dangerous. This was in the 30s, I believe, and 33, I think. Anyway, he accidentally put gasoline into the kerosene furnace, and he was very badly burned, and he managed to put the fire out before it destroyed the house, and then he died. But he saved his family who was upstairs. This was a huge blow to the family, and Gene, they had gotten into the automobile business. They kind of switched from groceries to automobiles. And Gene became a famous car guy, kind of by default. So he ran the Nash dealership. Right, so here's one of the ads that they ran. They're now, by the way, Greenberries. So they're at the end of what used to be Old South High before 42 kind of came in and dissected that. It was called Old South High Extended, right? This is a cool ad from the 50s. If you came into the business and looked at a car, they would give you a free model dealership and a free toy car. So Gene was a very good businessman. He made quite a good fortune, and he became very well connected. He was on the city council for quite a long time. One of the things that he was involved in that probably is now unfortunate is the urban renewal project that happened in the Northeast neighborhood. I'm not sure. I've never found any of his rationale or any rationale for like private rationale for why they did that. But I don't think Gene was personally out to destroy the Black neighborhood. It's just the sense that I get. Anyway, here's Gene with the red arrow. You can see he's right in the middle. This is a group of automobile dealers and their employees, right at the height of when the automobiles were becoming the new business thing. And very striking guy. He ended up, he was also on the board of Shenandoah College when they moved. He was instrumental in the move from Dayton to Winchester. Shenandoah College, he was the treasurer when that happened. Without this guy, Shenandoah College wouldn't have continued on. And we get to go back to the early house now. So sorry to do this. So we have this move. We've gone from agrarian to industrial, and then we've gone from industrial to kind of middle class merchants. Then we have this kind of modernity thing happening with automobiles and colleges, and then we have this postmodern thing that happens. And we're also lucky we have Roy and Phyllis early here with us. They bought the studio, they call it the studio, the Strayer Liggett house in 1987, right? 87. And it was their business location for 25 years. And there's some good stories there too. Roy was working on one of the back walls that was starting to sag. He was up on a scaffold and they were taking bricks out. And Phyllis came up and yelled at him, "Hey, Roy, we've got ice cream." And he's, "Oh, you got ice cream." And right as he turns around, the wall falls down right where his head had been. So ice cream saved Roy's life at the studio. So I want to get to this stuff too. The industrialism never went away. And one of the cool things now is that the two pieces of land that were lot number 2, the Tutwiler lot, and the original brewery distillery on Black's Run are now owned by the same company again, by the same people, and that's Munger and Sons. And I understand some of them might be watching too, so hello. Oh, it cut off the end here. P. Bradley, like I said, there still is a business. It's considered the oldest operative business in Rockland County. And they moved out of there in, I think in the 70s and went to Dayton. And of course, Matchbox now owns that property. And they're doing some really interesting work. Cool stuff that you might still see from the Bradley Foundry, right? If you walk around town, we love to walk. You can see these still. They're very cool. And I can't tell you how many thousands of times I saw this stuff and never thought about it until I did this project.
High Street here has Bradley manhole covers.
Oh, in Dayton. Oh, cool. You might have to put that in the museum someday. They're getting more and more rare. So these were pictures that we took recently, right as Matchbox started their renovations. It's hard to see, it's the inside of the old foundry. We saw those photos from the 40s with all the dirt and the grime. I can't imagine the amount of work it's going to take to redo that. This one on the top right is the Philo Bradley house, which he kind of expanded in the 1860s and was rebuilt over the site of Abraham Williams, who we saw a little kind of homestead shack over the old distillery. If you're looking north down Old South High Street, you can see this building. I looked today is now gone. So that kind of connected building there. It's a beautiful piece of architecture. It's actually been put on the National Historic Registry as a district, which is great. I'm trying to convince Roy to put his house on there. The buildings across the street on the east side of Old South High are owned by P. Bradley and Sons in Dayton. And they're in an equal state of disrepair. You can see a lot of graffiti and in some ways it's just, like I said, a microcosm of greater Harrisonburg, these 1860s, 1850s industrial buildings. They're kind of becoming postmodern. So the Strayer Liggett early house of today, it's beautiful. It's been kept up really nicely. I'm sure it's a huge amount of work. Look at the slope of those roofs. Can you imagine Addie Burkholder at 80 years old up on that roof with a bucket of hot tar? God, it's just incredible. Beautiful gardens. Roy and Phyllis have done a very good job of keeping this place up. The Tutwiler house as it is today. I love that on the mailbox you can still see it. You see Tutwiler Jr. Gene's widow, he was called Gene or Junior. His widow recently died about a year ago. And that's when Munger's Lumber bought the place. They renovated it at a huge cost and redid basically everything on the inside and some of the outside. And they're using it as housing. And the location of the old brewery. So I'm going to orient you here. So this is the Tutwiler house, kind of in the back. That's the Bradley house. And then Black's Run goes under the roadway here in kind of a man-made channel. And then this is the railroad. And then Munger's owns all of this. And then Munger's main building is kind of right here. The original, as far as we can tell, the original brewery distillery location was on Black's Run about right in here. And I can imagine back in the 1820s and 1830s when the slaves, after a long day or maybe on their one day off, would go back and brew some hooch. It's hard to imagine now. So that just about does it for me. I will definitely take questions. Like I said, there's a lot more that I could do. Oh, I have gone over quite significantly. I'm sorry about that. Hold on real quick. Couple of things. Roy is offered, he has a little museum in the house. He's offered, if you're interested, you can talk to him and he might show you that. Like I said, the books over here, you can grab one of those. If you want to give a donation, that'd be great. If we run out, I can always make more. I wanted to do two little plugs. Lauren Hossetter over here is owner of another historic house that I've been working on. We call it the Cannonball House. It's on Mount Clinton Pike. I actually lived there for about 4 years in the old slave quarters. And it's the bicentennial of that house. It's one of the oldest houses in the area. It's the original house there dates back to the 1740s. And the new house is now in its bicentennial year. Okay? So they're going to be doing on December 10th and 11th an open house. If you're interested in old houses and stuff, I would encourage you to come. I'm going to give a little talk. We're going to do some historic hymn singing. You can email me, my email is there. The other thing, here in Dayton, we wanted to plug is a Harmonia Sacra singing at Silver Lake Mill, Sunday, December 4th. If you don't know about Harmonia Sacra, it's kind of cool. We like sing these old songs. So, Bill, you had a question.
Yeah, going back to the Foundry, and you may not have come across this, where did they get the iron from?
Most of it came from Richmond area.
Okay,
At first.
The reason I said is that
Mhm.
the largest pig iron production of the highest grade was in Native Creek out here.
Hmm.
But the one that
Oh.
railroad ran this way.
Yeah.
So they got it up with.
The Forer brothers owned about 10,000 acres on Back Road, which is now, I forget the route number. They owned a huge amount of iron land back there, and they would mine it there. The Bradleys didn't own any land to speak of, so they had to import all of their raw materials. And
And the same question, where they get,
yeah, I think it all came from Richmond on the railroad to Winchester. And then they would have to horse and wagon it down. So if you can imagine, yeah, tens of thousands of pounds of pig iron in a month. I mean, they were casting things in some of these articles you'll read, they're casting 2.5 ton mill wheels, right? That you can imagine how much coal that would take to melt all that steel, right? And it was all being drawn by a horse and buggy, horse and wagon up here. Yes.
Could you speak a little more about the workers' housing and was that altruistic? Did he actually build the houses or just sell the lots? And it makes me think of the Pullman in Chicago, when, you know, the same idea of having workers' housing right there.
It was definitely, that was a very big idea, especially around the turn of the century. A lot of company housing was going on in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And even in places like Stanton, you can still see company housing neighborhoods. Usually they're kind of farmhouses, they were really cheap. I think the thing that distinguishes Philo Bradley and the local business culture here from someplace like Stanton or a big city, Midwestern business city, let's say, is that he actually did sell this land. He didn't develop it and then rent it out. I think he was, if not his primary concern, at least a very serious concern of Philo Bradley's was that his workers lived in good conditions. So he did actually sell these lots. And I went through about 400 beads of, it's really exhausting work. Trying to decipher where these pieces of land are and who the people are that are buying and selling them. But I really came to the conclusion that Philo Bradley and P. Bradley and Sons was doing ethical business. I think they were very interested in the welfare of their workers. And Tommy Bassford says that in his book. And Tommy was one of the employees there. It seems like they had a network of people around the country that they could recruit from. And like I said, it was a big family business that was spread out all over America. And I think because of that, I mean, it's reminiscent of like the mafia or something, you know, this family business, right? Like, but like the mafia in that period, I think they wanted to take care of their people. So I don't know, is that that may not be definitive, but that's my suspicion. So
Thank you.
Have you gone across where the brick was coming from? It continues from the tannery, all of a huge number of brick. Where were they from?
I think most of it was imported in the Old South High neighborhood. I'm not sure where. I did come across lists of materials that were imported in bulk. And one of Joshua Wilton's the thing he did after he left P. Bradley and Company was a hardware store, right? And I think one of his specialties was importing in bulk, things like bricks and nails, finished lumber. I suspect that Juliet Strayer got all the brick from him to build the Strayer house. I'm not sure where it was made though. Do you have any questions online here?
We have, thank you. So definitely,
Oh, I guess I just was so thorough. I answered everybody's questions, so.
well, I just think it's wonderful when you said another mystery. It's so fun because I was speaking to a group yesterday and I said a great metaphor for what historians do is detective work. And so, and I like to think of these digital archives and resources as microscopes. You know, it's like new science. It's really fun.
It is, and it's a very interesting time to be a historian. Like I said, we have this new technology that I can go through 10 million newspaper pages in an hour. Again, it's not the best technology, but it's, for example, let's go back and look at that. So like, if we have trouble reading some of this stuff or like this stuff here, imagine a computer trying to read it. So, I mean, it's a fascinating time to be a historian. You get little tiny glimpses, little clues, breadcrumb clues that are left for you to pick up keywords through Google or something. The Library of Congress has a great digital collection. I think it's something like 10 million newspapers that you can keyword search. It's incredible. I love doing this history work. I was a intel analyst in the Army. Yeah, there's some really poorly, like you can't read some of these. A lot of that's from the printing, actually, from the original newspaper printing. Yes. Most of them, well, these ones with the color like this are the Sanford and fire insurance maps. Sanborn, sorry.
And you were also online?
Yes, Library of Congress has digitized something like 15,000 of these as well. So it's really a great resource if you're interested in historic properties in Harrisonburg. I don't think there's many other towns in Rockingham County that they did this for. Maybe just a stretch of a couple houses or something, but let's see the other maps. I would point you to, again, to this book. This is the Aaron Price, Picturing Harrisonburg. It's for sale in the bookstore here. David Aaron Price, Randall Jones, Dale McAllister, Scott Suter, Kevin Bohr. Their books too. Scott Suter, of course, did these picture histories of Rockingham County. Dale McAllister, if you're interested in the racial equity stuff, this is a must. You have to read this. It's the story of Lucy Sims, and it covers a lot of the hard stuff: slavery, Reconstruction, racial violence. But it's the definite read. Of course,
And it's inspirational.
it is. Dale did an amazing job with that. John Wayland, Historic Harrisonburg. And the one that surprised me was this 200-year history of the Harrisonburg Masons. And there were some, like I said, the only picture of Philo Bradley and Joshua Weldon are their Mason pictures. And then last one I brought with me is the Heartland. I think most of these you can buy over here. Not necessarily all about Harrisonburg, but it's got good stuff in it. Anything else?
Well, then let's have a round of applause.